Hey everybody, I know I promised a overview of our year-long trip, so here it is. Let's get started, shall we? So we started off at our home base in Newport Richey, and from there we went right to Stephen C. Foster Park. Park is located right on the border of Georgia and Florida. It was a beautiful park, some bike riding, canoeing, boat trips out onto the Okefenokee, and then we headed over there to General Coffee State Park. General Coffee State Park is actually a really nice park. There's mountain biking, hiking right inside the park itself. Plus, there's a lot of things for kids to do. We were here during Halloween, so they had a whole setup where they did a haunted house, and it was really good for the kids. So if you have kids, definitely check out General Coffee State Park. It's a nice little place. So from General Coffee State Park, we headed over to our favorite park, Hard Labor Creek State Park. And Hard Labor Creek is awesome because you're right on Lake Rutledge, and we did some kayaking on the lake. And we also did a lot of mountain biking and hiking just in the general area. There's a couple of small hiking trails that are great for dogs that are right in the campsite itself. And the mountain biking is just a short drive or a quick bike ride down the road from the campground itself. And then from Hard Labor, we headed over to Camp Piney Beach, which is actually located in Tennessee, very close to Kentucky. This is an area that is known as Land Between the Lakes. The area itself was really nice. There's mountain biking and hiking in the area, and there's also a nice scenic drive that you can take that takes you to a buffalo refuge. The only problem we had at Camp Piney Beach is the campground was in a little bit of disrepair. From there, we headed over to Rock Island State Park, which is located in Tennessee, and this is a beautiful park. There's a nice waterfall. There's also a lot of other state parks in the area, one being Fall Creek Falls, and we had a really good time here. The campground itself is very nice, very clean, and well spaced out so that you have some privacy from other people. Once we left Rock Island State Park, we headed over to Bryson City. Bryson City is one of our favorite places to go in North Carolina. There's a lot of stuff to do within the city, and there's a lot of hikes around the surrounding area. And Charmaine had received an injury to her ribs while we were mountain biking back in Tennessee. So we decided that getting an Airbnb here would give us some time to recuperate, and also for her to be able to stretch out without having to cram into a small camper trailer for a while. While we were in Bryson City, we enjoyed a nice train ride and went on some hikes at the Solly Recreation Area, as well as a trail called the Road to Nowhere. After leaving Bryson City, we started heading down south and ended up at the Lazy J Campground, which is just outside of the DuPont State Forest in North Carolina. This was a nice campground. It was very private and very quiet, and we stumbled upon it at night, not knowing what we were going to encounter as we were headed on the way down. The next stop was at Keowee-Toxaway State Park, which was in South Carolina. This was a beautiful park. We enjoyed the multitude of hiking trails as well as the beautiful lake that this campground sits right upon. The campground is very clean, and because it was wintertime, there weren't that many people occupying the campground. We probably had about 2 or 3 neighbors, so it made it very peaceful for us. There is mountain biking in the area as well. We were now headed into Christmas, and we ended up at Maggie Valley Ski Resort. This was our final stop before we started our trip back to Florida. Maggie Valley is a really cool little area. There's a lot of little shops. And like I mentioned before, this area is a ski resort town, so when it starts snowing here, I'm sure this place picks up, but it was actually pretty mellow while we were visiting. Once we were done at Maggie Valley, we headed back to our home base to get ourselves ready for the second leg of our journey. Our second leg started off at Chewacla State Park Campground in Alabama. Some friends of ours told us about Chewacla and had mentioned that the mountain biking there was phenomenal, and it certainly didn't disappoint. The campground itself is a little bit small and a little cramped, but the facilities are nice and clean, and the showers were hot. There are also hiking trails in the area, but nothing too spectacular. From Alabama, we headed over to Mississippi and stayed at the Natchez State Park campground. Now, I have to say that I was kind of looking forward to getting into Mississippi, but Natchez State Park campground was a severe disappointment to us. Although the sites were very nice, the maintenance in the area was horrible. The hiking trails were completely blown out, not groomed, and not cared for, and there was nothing to do in the general area. After spending just a couple of days at this campground, we decided it was time to move on. We weren't really planning on it, but we decided at that point to head into Texas prematurely and stop over at Galveston Island. We grabbed a hotel in Galveston since I didn't have any prior arrangements, but I can tell you we had a really good time staying here. The city is very nice, the beaches are beautiful, and we'll definitely be back to Galveston Island at another time. From Galveston Island, we were back on schedule and headed over to Arkansas Bend Park, which is located just outside of Austin, Texas. This area is located near Balcones Canyonlands, which is actually a really nice park to do some hiking in with some beautiful scenery. You're on the shores of Lake Travis and the Colorado River at this campground, so there's a lot of boating and kayaking opportunities. From there, we went to Garner State Park, and Garner State Park is definitely a really nice gem. I don't know how popular this place is, but it should be really popular because there's amazing things to do in Garner. There's a beautiful river near the campground called the Frio River, which is crystal clear. There's amazing hikes to do right outside of the campsite, and the surrounding area is very quiet. I would highly recommend a trip to Garner State Park if you're in the area. After leaving Garner, we went to Seminole Canyon State Park, which is right on the border of the U.S. and Mexico. In fact, you can actually hike down to the Rio Grande River. Seminole Canyon State Park has some amazing Indian petroglyphs, and there are tours that are offered by the Park Service to these petroglyphs on a daily basis. We left Seminole Canyon to go to Devil's River State Natural Area. Devil's River is in the middle of nowhere, literally a 20-plus mile dirt road that heads out to the location, and all the campsites out there are boondocking sites. No power, no hookups. There's also no cell phone service in the area, so make sure you're prepared before you head out here. There are no services, so if you need to bring extra fuel, make sure you do so or gas up in the nearest town before heading onto the dirt road. The campsites are amazing, and the area is so peaceful and quiet you won't want to leave. Devil's River is crystal clear and is perfect for kayaking or just soaking around in the sun. From Devil's River, we ended up in Lubbock, Texas, just for a night as a pass-through on our way up to Palo Duro Canyon State Park. We arrived in Palo Duro the next morning, and I can honestly say this was one of our favorite destinations in the entire trip. Palo Duro Canyon is amazing. The campsites are incredible. There's mountain biking and hiking all throughout the park, and you're definitely not going to be bored. From Texas, we headed into New Mexico and stayed at the KOA in Alamogordo, New Mexico. We like to stay in KOAs every once in a while to get caught up on our laundry, and it's nice to have a campground with all the facilities right there, knowing that they're going to be clean and operative. Additionally, this was a great jumping off spot to go visit the town of Cloudcroft, New Mexico, which is really cool to see, and of course, White Sands National Monument. From there, we actually backtracked a little bit because we wanted to see Carlsbad Caverns, so we grabbed a hotel and stayed in Carlsbad for a couple of nights. We left New Mexico and finally headed into Arizona, our first stop being Tombstone, Arizona. Tombstone is a really cool little town. If you're in the area, you definitely need to check it out because there's a lot of history here, and it's really cool seeing some of the stuff that you might have seen in the movie Tombstone. We left Tombstone and headed over to the Gilbert Ray Campground, which is just outside of Tucson, Arizona. Gilbert Ray Campground sits right next to the Saguaro National Park, which has some amazing hiking, and of course you're amongst the giant saguaro cactus, which are absolutely amazing to see and a must-see while you're in southern Arizona. But the campground itself is really nice, although the spaces are a little bit cramped together. The facilities are clean, and there's mountain bike trails that lead right from the campground itself. From there we headed further north and stayed in Clarkdale, Arizona, which is just outside of Sedona. Staying in Sedona, Arizona itself is extremely expensive, and we were able to locate an Airbnb in Clarkdale that was very reasonably priced for the week. Clarkdale is a cool little town, and it's only about 25 to 30 minutes away from Sedona. So while we were there, we ventured into Sedona multiple times, did some hiking, mountain biking, and also headed up to the little town of Jerome, which sits on a mountain just above Clarkdale. It was then time to head to our next favorite destination, which is Lake Powell. We stayed at the Lake Powell Resort, which is right on the shores of Lake Powell, next to the Wahweap Marina. The resort was beautiful, and this gave us the opportunity to take in some hikes in the area, some off-road trails, the mountain bike trail in Page, Arizona, that's called the Rimview Trail, and of course, some kayaking on Lake Powell. It was then time to head over to Bryce Canyon, where we stayed at the Ruby's Inn RV Park and Campground. Ruby's Inn has everything that a camper could want. There's a general store there. The campsites are amazing. And of course, you have direct access to get into Bryce Canyon, which we took full advantage of. We did some drives through the park and did some amazing hikes down to the bottom of the canyon. We stayed here for a few nights and then moved our base of operations to two different places. One was a hotel just outside the park because we ended up getting a snowstorm, and then another was a boondocking site in Red Canyon, which is along Utah 12. This gave us a total of about 9 days in the Bryce Canyon area to explore. After leaving Bryce Canyon, we headed over to the Burr Trail, which is located in Grand Staircase Escalante National Monument. This was a boondock site, but the location was absolutely phenomenal. We had peace and quiet, a huge site all to ourselves, and absolutely no one around us for several days. We then went to the north shore of Lake Powell and stayed at the Bullfrog RV Campground. While we were here, we went on one kayaking trip, but discovered that the kayak was leaking. The rest of the time, we just kind of relaxed. It was a nice campground and a nice place to get caught up on laundry. From this location, we actually headed up to an area that I didn't place on the map. We stayed for a night just outside of Goblin Valley State Park. We found a nice boondocking site located within a canyon. Little did we know we were going to get completely destroyed by a windstorm that night. We had to leave our campsite and headed over to Green River for a couple of nights to avoid the sandstorm. Once we got done staying in Green River, we ended up heading over to Thousand Lakes RV Park just outside of Capitol Reef National Park. This was an amazing campground with so much to do and very clean facilities. It also was real close to Capitol Reef National Park, which has amazing hiking and beautiful views. We did some off-roading in the general area as well. From there we left and went to Millsite State Park in Utah. When I initially booked this location, I saw that it was on a reservoir, and I was hoping that we'd be able to get in some kayaking. But when we arrived, of course, just like a lot of the places that we were at, there was hardly any water in the reservoir at all. However, there were some really cool drives and some really short hikes that we took in the general area, so we did enjoy our time here despite that fact. We left Millsite and headed over to the town of Beaver, Utah, where we jumped up into the mountains at a 10,000-foot elevation and stayed in an Airbnb for a few nights before heading to Moab. It was absolutely beautiful up here, and fresh snow had fallen the day that we had arrived. So we got to play in the snow while we were up here and really enjoyed our short time. From there, we headed into Moab to meet up with our family. Moab is absolutely an amazing place. If you haven't been, you need to go. We enjoyed some amazing hikes in the area while we were there, rented some side-by-sides and headed out to Chicken Corners, and just generally enjoyed some good family fun. There is a lot to do in Moab. We left Moab and headed into Ouray, Colorado. Now, I don't know how this place is pronounced. Ouray. I'm probably butchering it. But either way, it was a beautiful town, some beautiful hikes in the area, and the town itself has some really cool eating establishments and is very friendly. We took a nice drive along the $1 Million Highway and visited the town of Silverton, and then took a long route on the way back to our campground by driving through Durango. We left Colorado and headed back into Utah and stayed in Park City for a couple of nights at an Airbnb there. We got another dousing of snow upon our arrival, but Park City is a really cool place, and we enjoyed a nice bike ride while we were relaxing there, awaiting our Airbnb in Salt Lake City. We stayed in Salt Lake City, visited some friends, and did a paved bike ride there. While we were in Salt Lake City, we originally were planning on heading into Wyoming, but checking the weather before we left, we learned that there was a huge cold front heading through the area we were planning on going to, which was leaving a lot of snow behind. After some consideration, we both decided that we were going to take a trip up the Oregon coast and go visit the redwoods. On our way out to the coast, we stayed at Water Canyon Recreation Area in Nevada and boondocked it here for a couple of nights. There's a nice hike that leaves right from the campground area itself, and it was very quiet in this location. Once we left Nevada, we headed into California and stayed in Lake Tahoe for about a week. This was a nice little stop, and we had a great time here hiking and mountain biking. We also went out on the lake with a kayak one day. Lake Tahoe is absolutely beautiful, and we will be back here again. From Lake Tahoe, we ended up staying at Meadowview Campground in California, which is just outside of the Lassen National Park. We stayed here just for one night on our way out to the Merrill Campground, where we had several nights booked. Merrill Campground is absolutely beautiful, very clean, and there's a nice paved trail that runs along the shore of the lake. We then headed over to Camp Klamath RV Park, which was just outside of the Redwoods. This gave us a nice jumping off spot to be able to go visit the Redwood Forest, and the area itself was actually very nice. Camp Klamath is a very nice campground, and I would highly recommend it if you're in the area. And thus began our drive up the Oregon coast. Our first stop was the Sutton Campground, which is located in Oregon. The campground is very nice, heavily wooded, has some great hiking in the area, and was somewhat taken care of. When we first arrived, the porta potties were the only thing functioning because they had shut the bathrooms down, and they were a little bit full. But after complaining to the park management, the next day they were cleaned out and everything was fine. From Sutton, we headed over to Newport, Oregon, which is a very cool little fishing town. We enjoyed a visit to the tidal pools at the base of the Yaquina Bay Lighthouse and enjoyed some deep sea fishing. From Newport, we went to Nehalem Bay State Park, which sits right on the Pacific, bordered by the Nehalem River. The beach area is nice and wide and very private. This would be a great place to go during the summertime with the kids because you could hike right out onto the beach, and it's absolutely beautiful there. From there, we headed into Washington State so that we could drive through the North Cascades. Our first stop was at the Wenatchee Confluence State Park, which we stayed in for just a couple of nights on our way out. The park is really nice, and there are a couple of things to do in the area, but honestly, this wasn't our type of camping. There's only one paved/gravel trail that leads out of the campground, but there's not a lot to do in the area unless you are into city visits. We did a little side visit over to Arlington, Washington, so we could visit Seattle and see my daughter for Father's Day. We stayed in a hotel at this location because it was just a temporary stop. From Arlington, we headed over to the New Halem Campground in Washington, which is at the entrance to the North Cascades. There are some beautiful hikes along the Skagit River, and there are some amazing viewpoints along the highway. From here, we were able to grab a couple of hikes actually in the Cascades. This is a beautiful area, and I would highly recommend it. The New Halem Campground didn't have any electrical hookups, and the only problem we ran into was the solar panels were not getting enough sun with all the trees, so we had to run the generator a lot, and we ended up running out of power before the end of the stay. We then drove through the Cascades and ended up at the Newport Little Diamond Lake KOA just outside of Spokane. As usual with all our KOA stays, we got caught up on some laundry, and there are some nice hiking trails within the park that we enjoyed. We then jumped over to Idaho and stayed in one of our favorite campgrounds of the trip, the Lost Moose Campground in Cataldo, Idaho. This campground is family owned and is very nice. It's also near a lot of ATV trails and a lot of hiking trails. If you have an ATV or a four-wheel drive, this is a great campground to be staying at. There's a lot of opportunities in this area. From Lost Moose, we were going to head down to Boise, and on the way down, we decided to do a little boondocking along the Salmon River. We found a nice little spot just off the highway and spent the night here. From that boondocking spot, we headed into Boise, Idaho. And the main reason for the stop in Boise was twofold. My wife had to fly back to Florida for an event, so we had to be close to the airport. Also, a buddy of mine lives in Eagle, Idaho, just outside of Boise. So I paid him a visit, and while my wife was out of town, we enjoyed the mountain biking trails in Eagle. There's a really cool bike park just outside of his front door, and then we also went on a nice downhill ride just outside of Boise. Upon leaving Boise, our next destination was a nice boondocking site at the Tetons in Wyoming. We stayed here for about 5 days, but ran into a problem when our little dog Nugget ended up getting bit by buffalo flies, which caused a severe allergic reaction. During our stay here, we had to drive numerous times through Yellowstone National Park to go visit a vet that was located in Bozeman, Montana. The Tetons were beautiful, but keep in mind, dogs are not allowed in the national park itself, so we had a little bit of an issue leaving the dogs in the camper trailer alone in bear country without any hookups. Although the temperatures were decent, we didn't want to take any chances. So after seeing what we wanted to see, and then realizing that our dog needed more medical care, we ended up doing a bypass over to Casper, Wyoming, where there was a more advanced veterinarian office. Once they diagnosed our dog and were able to provide her with the appropriate medication, we headed up to Casper Mountain and stayed at an Airbnb there while she recuperated. From there, we continued on the rest of our journey and stayed at the Devil's Tower KOA, located just outside of Devil's Tower National Monument. If you've never visited Devil's Tower but had seen it in the Close Encounters movie, you absolutely have to go. There's some amazing hikes in this area, and the tower itself is just a phenomenal sight to see. The KOA there is actually right at the base of Devil's Tower and right at the entrance to the park. Plus, what's really cool is they play the Close Encounters movie every night on a big screen TV outside. Charmaine had never seen the movie, so that was a first for her. We then headed into South Dakota to stay at the Custer, Mount Rushmore, Black Hills KOA. This is a great jumping off spot to go see Mount Rushmore, drive the Needles Highway, and also visit some of the smaller towns that are along the way that are actually really cool. We arrived here during Bike Week, so it was a little bit crowded, but for the most part, everything was somewhat manageable. As another afterthought, we decided that we were going to head over to the Thousand Lakes area of Minnesota, since we had never been. We arrived in Minnesota and stayed at the Cass Lake Loop, which is located right on the shores of Cass Lake. Cass Lake is amazing, the campground was awesome, and we enjoyed kayaking on the lake, and the weather was absolutely beautiful during the time that we arrived. From there, we headed down to Iowa and started our return journey back to Florida. We were pleasantly surprised when we stayed at the Palisades-Kepler State Park in Iowa. I was expecting cornfields and flatlands in Iowa, but boy was I wrong. Palisades-Kepler has to be one of the cleanest campgrounds we stayed at on this entire trip for a state park. There are a ton of hiking trails that leave right from the campground area itself, and the campsites are spread apart and the facilities are the cleanest that we had seen on this trip so far. We left Iowa and headed down to Missouri, where we stayed at the Harry S. Truman Park. This park would have been fantastic had it not been for all the chiggers. It was absolutely infested. We took in a couple of hikes, went down by the river, and enjoyed some peace and quiet here before Charmaine got completely eaten up by the bugs. We were actually forced out of the campground. It was so bad because they were falling from the trees at our campsite. The facilities there were okay, nothing to write home about, but if they got rid of the bug problem there, this place would be absolutely fantastic. We had to leave early and stayed in a hotel before we headed over to our next destination, which was the Ozark Cabin, still located in Missouri. It was a good thing that I had booked this, because at least this way we weren't exposed to any of the bugs. We tried one hike one day, but we got infested with chiggers again and decided that Missouri was not for us. After a nice little rest at the Ozark cabin, we headed down to Alabama, where we stayed at the Decatur Wheeler Lake KOA. This KOA is an average KOA, nothing major, has some good fishing opportunities, and the campsites are pretty decently spaced apart. It was a little crowded when we arrived, which we were not used to. Not to mention the humidity that was beginning to set in now that we were back in the South. From there, it was back full circle to Hard Labor Creek State Park, where we stayed for another week. Not much else to say, except we really love this park. Every time somebody asks us for recommendations on places to stay in Georgia, this is our first place that we would recommend to them. Then from Hard Labor, it was only fitting that we returned to Stephen C. Foster State Park, which we stayed at for a few more nights. But because we are now in a different season, we had to contend with mosquitoes and a lot of bugs. The weather came in one night and absolutely destroyed our awning. At that point in time, we came to the realization that we needed to cut our trip short, not to mention that we also had a wedding that we needed to attend in Las Vegas in October. So after one stop in Tallahassee to go visit Charmaine's son, who was in college there, we celebrated his 21st birthday and then headed back to Newport Richey. And that concludes the overview of our trip. Hope you enjoyed following along. I'll have some more video coming later on of some of the portions of our trip that I did not post initially. So take care, thanks for watching, and have a good one.